so far removed from the idea of America and its minarchism written in the United States Constitution, where we have to bring her back to where she belongs. Thank you for listening to this episode of Chasing Life, Liberty, and Minarchy. My beautiful liberty defenders worldwide, appreciate y'all taking time out this evening to enjoy some libertarian, not necessarily libertarian, but more nuanced than that, minarchist speech, because I still firmly believe minarchism is going to save this country we call the United States of America from its own self, from the very people that live to subvert our beautiful, beautiful nation and to bastardize the countryside that we as the people have decided to own in part in conjunction with the states. I mean, you gotta love that that public-private partnership, you know. But again, I welcome y'all. My name is Roderick Threets. Those of you that already know, you already know my full name. You already know how that goes down. The path to minarchy, right? Before we get started, make sure you are subscribed, all that good stuff. Make sure you check out the Patreon at patreon.com/TOLMF. There's a couple of dignified scholarly pieces up there. I actually wrote my first medical research paper based on sources I found on the Patreon. So those of you that are curious about folic acid and autism, I decided to take a chunk at that one over a period of time and decided to write a piece up on it. It's on Patreon. Check it out. Patreon.com/TOLMF. Make sure you go in there and check that out. I find it to be quite enlightening. Also, if you haven't subscribed to this channel, Torture Liberty Media on Rumble, make sure you do that. Make sure you also do it on Facebook. Make sure you also do it on YouTube. If you're over there, make sure you're doing it on Twitch and on Kick. And those of you that like the airwaves, make sure you tune in to WRMI FM out of good old Okeechobee, Florida. We out there in them streets, baby. All right. This is what we do. This is how we do. Remember, the last episode, right, we talked about the politician's gambit, right? And we learned that even the most principled politician fights is usually a constant battle between, or I should say not between per se, against the ratchet effect, right? Which is a cycle of frustration where any victory is constantly threatened, right? But in this episode, we're going to completely shift our entire focus, okay? We're going to move to the centralized system of government to decentralized power of the people, right? This is the grassroots movement path. And it's the strategy just is simple: cultural secession. And we'll get into that. I know it's a word I kind of made up a little bit. Maybe it's already a set of couple words together, but I kind of made that up. But I think I'm going to probably coin this one. I'll probably, write a law for my humble abode here to create a coin with the word cultural secession on it. You're going to probably hear it a lot through this. You're probably not. But I want you to remember that those two words, cultural secession, right? Now, cultural secession, right, by definition, and I think I've kind of made this up. Now, I did make this up. Let's just keep it real because y'all know me. I like inventing stuff, even if it's words that don't make sense. But this one's going to make sense. Cultural secession is the belief that the most effective way to shrink the state is not to fight it in Congress, but to starve it, right? By systematically removing the people's dependence on it. Let me repeat that definition. Cultural secession is the belief that the most effective way to shrink the state is not to fight it in Congress, but to starve it by systemically removing the people's dependency on it. Right? If we before I go on, I want to kind of tell you how I came up with those two words together, right? Because we look at our current political climate right now more than ever, right? It's past dog eat dog. It's past step on your neighbor to get ahead. We're at the point that people are standing on the backs of their neighbors shooting people. Now, this is where we are, right? We have a nation that is so morally and culturally corrupt against the American way, and it's the way of life that it gives us, that they will ignore the law to try to run down federal agents, right? Y'all seen the article? The girl got shot. Good. Should have unloaded the whole clip on her ass. You want my opinion? Unload, dump that bitch. Because you don't have a right, people. You don't have a right to accost or harass law enforcement officers. You don't have the right to walk up on them. But these federal agents, they're nice. They're letting you pull up and then they push you down. But you remember, if you run up on any law enforcement officer, whether it be a policeman, a deputy sheriff, FDLE, a U.S. Marshal, a state trooper, you run up on them on their gun side, you might as well say you are a dead man. Because the first instance is you're going to try to grab for their gun. I don't care which way you look at it. You are a dead man. Suicide by cop. This is the culture that this current state of America is in. I believe it's a cycle of violence. Call me naive. This is a cycle of violence. Okay. But this is our current culture right now. Right? So in order, using the word, and that's how I came up with the word, because these people that are attacking ICE are so dependent on the state continues to expand itself. The culture of the people that they see, oh no, they need more protection. And they're going to expand themselves in any direction they can. AKA Trump sending the National Guard in when the states are not quelling their own many rebellions within. Right? The state, by default, the state is expanding itself to protect the citizens. It shouldn't be happening from the federal level. You see what I'm saying? Though people, and there's semantics and there's other things that we can agree and disagree on, but at this point, on principle, Donald Trump is expanding the state to protect the citizens because the knuckleheads that are in power in these states do not want to do it. And then turn around want to talk about this expansion of the state, but they're not protecting the citizens, and they're telling law enforcement to stand down from helping federal agents. See, if I was Donald Trump, any law enforcement funding you're getting from the federal government, you're cut the fuck off immediately, if not sooner. Actually, give us a reimbursement of the shit we already gave you this year. Give us a reimbursement. And then you come to the White House like a puppy dog asking for funding for your law enforcement. But anyway, that's how I got to the word cultural secession, because the people that love the American way of life and have lived it and have upheld it, right, are the people, right, that are not dependent on the system. So as we take ourselves away from this system, right, we take away the culture that the state feeds us off of. That's how you get cultural secession. That's how I came up with it. Crazy, right? But if the further the definition of cultural secession to give a little bit more clarity, right? If we can prove that the market, charity, and community can solve problems better than the government, the state will become irrelevant. And those hoodlums, they will become irrelevant, right? Right? This path, okay, is about building a better alternative or parallel until the old system dries up and goes away. But by no means the new alternative system, as they try to stop you, you know it's going to be a battle, right? The same thing with civil rights. Civil rights was a parallel to the state's oppression, right? Let's put that in context. We had a cultural secession when it came to civil rights. Even though people separated during Jim Crow, right? They were forced to culturally separate because they didn't feel like they were Americans because of the way they were treated, right? So they created a parallel alternative. What did the state do with the help of its own actors, right? They went in and harassed the alternative path. They tried to delegitimize the other path, right? And eventually, what happened? The system of Jim Crow withered away, didn't it? Right? The system of Jim Crow went away because of the parallel alternative starved the state of the power that it had over the people, especially the people that were melanated in this country under that oppression of Jim Crow. And I said melanated again because, again, we got to remember the largest Jim Crow lynching in the United States was 17 Sicilians in New Orleans, Louisiana. That was the largest mass lynching in United States history. There were Sicilians. This is how we got Columbus Day. That's a story for another day. Now, with that being said, now we can do this again, this cultural secession, to starve the state out of its power, and their hoodlums that upholds this system will wither away also because they won't know what to do. But you have to be ready to defend what you have built. My question is, are you ready to defend what we are going to build to bring this nation back to where she is supposed to be? That's the question. Now, as I researched this whole word I made up, this cultural secession, right? Right. Yeah, we have to think about the philosophical foundation of the grassroots path, right? Because the philosophical foundation is in two camps: voluntarism and mutual aid. All right. Now, this premise is that most people rely on the state not because they philosophically support it, but it's because it's the default setting, right? The state has monopolized the problem solving in this issue. To shrink the state, you must change the culture of dependency, right? You must, to shrink the state, I'll say it again, to shrink the state, you must change the culture of dependency. dependency. Now, this approach addresses the why of the state, not just the how of legislation. See, the grassroots revolutionary believes you must first change hearts and minds, proving that individual liberty and community compassion are complementary, not mutually exclusive. But the goal, okay, is to build a parallel society, right? A network of voluntary institutions so robust and effective that people willingly and enthusiastically choose to opt out of the state's offerings, right? So, what are we talking about here? We're talking about, we have programs like, you know, the schools will have like lunches, free lunches for kids in poor communities that get Title One funds, Title One Part A funds, right? From the federal government, right? They produce free lunches, right? And this goes back to the Black Panthers idea, right? School lunches, right? We have these schools that get funding because they're in poor or more rural areas, that they provide lunches during the summer for the kids. Well, why can't a charity do that? Why can't a community coalition do that? I mean, we have Meals on Wheels, which end up getting funded by the federal government, but that's another discussion for another day. But why aren't people creating community groups to make these lunches, and you get a list of, the poor people, right? Because we got to remember, right? It takes gas to get to these schools to get the free lunch. So is the free lunch really free? Or you got to spend $3 in gas, right? You get $3 in gas, you spend $3 in gas to go to and fro. Your lunch is $3. It ain't free, it's $3, right? So why can't we create community coalition, get food donations, make brown bag lunches, get addresses of people that may be in need, and obviously make sure it's confidential, and you go drop off a couple brown bag lunches every day for those kids, right? We can do that. The state doesn't have to do that, right? The state doesn't have to fund the school, and you come to the school to get the free lunch, right? You can create a community coalition to do that, right? We have these signs that talk about, these commercials that talk about, there's kids going to bed hungry. Why is the community not getting a list up locally of people that may be right at that poverty line or below that poverty line? And why we're not going out getting donations for these people and bringing them food? And you don't have to interact with them. You just need to get the address, right? And you go drop off a box of food at these people's house. You ain't got to talk to drop off a box of food, right? Because I know people can be proudful. Please understand, I know people are proudful and don't want to ask for help. But when you hungry and your kids are going hungry, right? Sometimes you might have to just, even if it's anonymous, say, hey, we don't have food at this address, right? And you had that coalition of people come together, get food donations, or already have a food bank established, right? You throw some things in the thing, throw a couple packages of meat, whatever, and you go sit on that family's front doorstep, right? I want people to understand this, right? We can do this as a community, create this parallel society, right? We shouldn't, we shouldn't have the state funding these things. That is my point. That's my point, right? Now, historically, my idea, right, is not a brand new novel idea. I'm just bringing it to existence because it's something we can do, right? We got to remember, right? Before the 1900s, right? Millions of Americans relied on fraternal societies like the Masons or the Independent Order of Oddfellows, right? For food, right? Then there's this era between like 1870 and 1910 they called the golden age of fraternalism, right? Where about 40% of the adult male population belonged to at least one mutual aid society. I want you to think about that. You had 40% of men of all demographics that belonged to at least one mutual aid society, like the Kiwanis, like the Rotary Club. There's a couple others, the Lions Club, right? We had people that belonged to these organizations. You know where today in 2025 that number of the male population that belongs to a mutual aid society, you know where that number is? You know what that number is today? 19%. 19% of adult men belong to a mutual aid society. I know why. We know why. We understand this, right? The economy's got us strained, right? Sometimes men have to work 80 hours a week to support their family. And the women work just as hard at home to teach the kids and cook and all that good stuff. Take the kids to doctor's appointments, right? I get why men are not in it. But we have to start creating the ability for men and women both to join mutual aid societies, right? Or create one on their own and go along with it and get people to come in, right? Because you got to remember these mutual aid societies, right? These groups provide life insurance, health insurance, right, and welfare outside of government. This is all based on community donations, things of that nature, right? And these mutual aid societies, right, prove that voluntary community action can provide a robust safety net, right? And again, this culture started to decline with the rise of like modern centralized government programs in 1993 and 1993, back in the 1930s, right? During the Great Depression and a lot of the New Deal policies, right? Just something to think about, right? Another form of cultural secession, right? The most powerful form happens right in your own neighborhood, right? It's about achieving localized sovereignty through decentralized community action, right? For example, right? We have BIDs, or another name for us, private public services, right? See, we see in today's like widespread use of business improvement districts or special assessment districts. Okay, now these districts surged into popularity in about the 1980s, 1990s as cities struggled with urban decay, right? Which involves property owners voluntarily agreeing to pay an additional fee to fund private security patrols, sanitation, and street maintenance, right? They are the direct quantifiable vote against the inadequacy of municipal services, right? Proving that people will voluntarily tax themselves for higher quality private services, aka HOA per se, right? But a little different. BIDs are a little different, or SADs are a little bit different. And I can explain that another time, right? Now, let's think about this, right? When we're another part of this concept is opting out of justice, okay, or better known as ADR, right? As every person chooses private mediation or binding arbitration to settle a contract dispute instead of entering the state's very slow and costly court system is also practicing localized sovereignty, right? See, this entire industry of alternative dispute resolution, right, is a voluntary market mechanism that can be accelerated and has accelerated since the 1980s. And it proves, right, it proves my point. Private, market driven justice is often faster, cheaper, and more efficient than the state's monopoly. I want y'all to think about this a second, right? You go to jail, you get arrested, you go to jail, right? Let's say you go to jail on a Friday. You won't see a judge till Monday, right? You get arraigned on Monday, and let's say they set your trial date 3 months from that date. See how slow justice is? Hell, it takes 20 years for someone to die on death row, right? From the first appeal to the last appeal could be an expanse of 20 years, right? But ADR will provide a private, market-driven justice that is cheaper and faster and more efficient. Let's bring up another one. Healthcare, right? Healthcare is always a huge concern, right? Remember our discussion on health sharing ministries in episode 3, right? This particular model, with its roots back in the 80s, became a very powerful parallel institution. The founding of the groups like Christian Healthcare Ministries, right, was a direct response to rising healthcare costs. And as membership grew in that particular healthcare group, it grew to over 1 million people, and it demonstrated that a large-scale voluntary mutual aid can effectively provide a safety net outside of the highly regulated, expensive government insurance complex. Now, let's talk about the cultural revolution a second, right? Because the cultural revolution is very important. Not only the secession, but we need a revolution within it too, right? As we talked about the difference of people attacking the police because what they've been propagandized is right. But we're not going down that road. We're staying here a second, right? The true grassroots change, right, is intellectual and aesthetic. Okay, you have to make the idea of liberty attractive, moral, and culturally dominant, right? On the adverse, isn't that what the other team has done, aka Democrats, aka leftists, aka whatever anti-liberty group you want to talk about, right? That's what they've done, right? They've made their way of life culturally dominant, and it makes it feel moral, right? And attractive. This is how we get guys like Tyler Robinson, because the idea of chaos is attractive, moral to these people, and it's culturally dominant. AKA, ooh, I'm glad Charlie Kirk is dead. Your homie's dead. I'm glad they should. That's what I'm talking about. That's the culture we need to breed out. This is why we need to bring liberty back to the forefront to make it attractive, moral, and culturally dominant. Right? Let's talk about another example, right? The educational secession, which is part of this cultural revolution, right? Because if you're not educated, you can't create a culture, right? Culture has a set rules and values and taboos, right? And it starts with education, right? So one of the first things we need to get into is educational secession, as I call it, right? Homeschooling, right? The modern homeschooling movement, just for recollection, started in the 70s, okay? And it was driven by what? Dissatisfaction with public schools, right? And what did we get after that? What did the government do after homeschooling started taking off a little bit? We got the Department of Education in 1979 from Jimmy Carter, didn't we? To quell the rebellion, because the current system of education before Jimmy Carter's Department of Education, homeschool was rising. They was creating that parallel, weren't they? They were creating that parallel. Government said, no, we don't like this. We don't like this. We shut down. We give Department of Education. But what the federal government did not expect was its rapid growth, right? Because by 93, right, mainly because of a lot of grassroots legal advocacy, homeschool was legal in all 50 states. The government tried their best to use the Department of Education and wield the executive branch's power, right, to stop homeschooling. And they were not successful because the states went in and the people went into the states and got homeschooling legalized in all 50 states, right? And then the number of students in homeschooling have exploded since 2020. I wonder why. I think this thing called COVID, right? This thing called COVID-19 expanded this educational secession that started in the 70s, right? This movement was built on co-ops and self-funded academies at first, right? This is that part of that revolutionary route we talked about in episode 3, the revolutionary's path, episode 3, when we talked about that, right? Or it might have been 4, might have been 3, might have been 4, one of those. But anyway, y'all know what y'all if y'all remember, you remember, right? But this was a revolutionary act because it reasserts parental sovereignty over education, proving that families can provide a high quality education without the state's curriculum and bureaucracy. Let me bring up another thing, right? Let's talk about this displaced the state media, right? The state media, MSNBC, CBS, Comcast, Disney, ABC, right? State media. Those are all state media, right? Because they all get funding from the state, right? Right? When we talk about this, when we're displacing it, I'm talking about podcasting, kind of like what we're doing here, or broadcasting radio from your home, like I'm doing here, right? We can talk about art, literature, independent media, YouTube, independent journalism, right? These things are crucial for changing people's underlying assumptions about authority, right? And this is kind of personal because I know a lot of you, right? A lot of you started listening to me back when I was the Rod Threet show back in 2017, right? And then I transitioned to the Conservative Enclave. No, I'm sorry. It was the Black Patriot show after the Rod Threet show. Jay, I ain't got my things. I got my things together, and after the Black Patriot show, then came the Conservative Enclave. Okay. And then after the Conservative Enclave, right, we made that complete switch, right, to Southern Liberty. And we've been Southern Liberty ever since, including its extensions, right? Experience Today and all of that, right? But you've always heard me talk about authority, right? When we talk about authority, right? You've heard me say it all. And y'all have heard me talk about the Democrats, Republicans alike, right? Just like the old intro, right? The Democrats and Republicans will usurp your liberty if you're not paying attention, right? I've told you about authority. And a lot of us have gotten into conversations, right, with that, right? And we've had pushback on each other. And we've came to some understandings, right? Which is good. But this is, again, right? This is what this space is for, right? Now, I will also say that the success of, like, let's say, independent investigative journalists, right? Even this show, right, proves that the public is willing to pay directly for information that bypasses the old state sanctioned gatekeepers like the legacy media, right? This decentralization of media, right, has gained, has gained a lot of traction since, late 2000s, like 2008, 2009, right? And using technology to render centralized media less essential. And we see that. This is why the government keeps constantly coming after people like me and people like the Ben Shapiro's and God bless Charlie Kirk's and all these people, because the alternative media is giving you the truth. And the legacy media in cahoots with the government can't have that because it's messing up their money, right? Their money, right? Right. Here's another shift in cultural, right? That just happened in a lot of states, right? Constitutional carry, right? And we've heard about the effort of constitutional carry, gun rights for decades, right? And this was successful because it was a more of a cultural shift to frame self-defense as a non-negotiable right, which it is, right? Not a privilege requiring a permit, right? And this, again, this was an effort of incrementalism, if y'all remember from episode 1, where I described what incrementalism is, right? Now, as we start swinging around to the cherry side on this one, make sure you like and subscribe. Make sure you're sharing this with your peoples, right? I greatly appreciate it, right? Get our rights back. We got to spread the information. We got to plant those seeds of minarchy, plant those seeds of liberty to shift the culture, right? That's what we got to do, right? Now, while this whole thing I've talked about is powerful, right? This grassroots path has very significant challenges, right? Which everything grassroots does. Anybody that's done a grassroots rally or grassroots program, these two sets of words you're gonna just nod your head about. One of them is scalability. The other one is fringe perception. If you've ever done anything grassroots, you know what I'm talking about. I don't have to say anymore. Right? To scale a grassroots movement takes a lot of legwork because it starts out as one. You got to get another interested to join the cause. Then you both have to get another person just as interested, right? You go 2 to 4. Then those 4 people still have to get one more person to join. You understand the process. Scalability is hard. And then you're going to get attacked from the fringes of complete opposing views, right? For example, I'm gonna use a real example. We talked about the Free State Project, right, up in New Hampshire, right, which began back in 2001, right? Now, just this Free State Project It's still active, right? Working towards its goal 2 years later, right? This is the ultimate example of grassroots attempt at scale here, okay? The goal itself is revolutionary, okay? But the method relies on grassroots incremental community building, right? Because I mean, again, they've been building for 2 decades, and that effort, them even still sustaining this, right, proves that while the idea is powerful, okay, gaining critical mass is very slow, and the movement constantly fights fringe perception and internal conflicts, which limits its ability to attract necessary mass adaptation. Now, the irony is that more a movement isolates itself to achieve ideological purity, the less effective it becomes at achieving widespread change. And that's the problem, right? Now, I'm going to wrap this up this evening by saying this. The grassroots movement is the soul of the minarchist project. It provides the cultural foundation for the political work and the functional alternative to the state's systems. It changes the culture of dependency into a culture of self-reliance. Now, as we look ahead, we see both the political gambit and the grassroots movements are necessary. The politician provides the defensive shield, preventing the state from crushing the revolution, while the community builds the future society underneath that shield. That's my vision, and it can work. But we have to get on the same page. We have to get on the same page when it comes to that. Next week on episode 7, we will shift back to the kabuki theater, aka the political theater, but with a new sense of urgency, right? We will explore what I'm calling the final battle, the state's last stand, and examine how the government and its established interests inevitably fights back against both the incremental and revolutionary threats to their power. With that, I appreciate everybody checking in this evening and listening to what we got going on over here. The new listeners, I appreciate you. Hope you come back for episode of the episodes of the other Monday, the Fifth Estate, 9:30 p.m. on Tuesday, The Experience Today with my lovely co-host Valerie Zen on Tuesdays, 9:30 Eastern, and on Friday for Southern Liberty, 9:35 p.m. on Friday. We'll talk about it. We here. Remember, people, love your neighbors, love your family, but ultimately, you got to love yourself. Because if you do not love yourself, you can't love anyone or anything else. Until next time, peace and love, and good night.